We cannot operate at the same pace when it's that kind of inflation that we are dealing with.
We have a accommodative monetary policy supporting our real economy throughout this year.
50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Paris. Now, here's what's coming up on today's program. It's on the table. Jay Powell says a half-point rate increase in the next Fed meeting is possible. Lining up the money, Elon Musk secures billions from Wall Street in his bid for Twitter while pledging $21 billion of his own wealth. And stay with Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Yes, this hour we speak to not one, but two representatives for each of the French presidential candidates. We'll be joined by Clément Beaune. He is the French Europe Minister, and Herve Juvin, an MEP for the National Rally. You can send in your questions on IB plus TV Go. But first, let's check on the markets. So we're lucky because our very own Danny Berger's in London. Danny.
Unfortunately, not in beautiful Paris alongside you, Francine. Look, it is an ugly start to the last day of the week. Euro Stoxx 600 falling more than 1% at one point. It's pared some of those losses now down just about 0.8%. But really, this is off the back of those concerns in the U.S. about higher rates finally filtering through to the equity market. S&P 500, that fell more than 1.5% yesterday. So today it is flat to slightly lower. Tech basically unchanged as well this morning. Some of the worst of the selling in the bond market has eased, though we're still up by about 5 basis points on your 10-year yield. How soon will we hit 3% with Fed Chair Jay Powell saying that 50 basis points, that's on the table, opening the door to it again. The market thinks it's going to happen 3 times in a row. And sterling, that is getting hammered today, down nearly 1%. Some ugly data in the UK, be it consumer confidence falling to the lowest since 2008, and at the same time, retail sales looking weaker as well. Here's your map. Again, most of these regions are off their lows of the morning. The CAC 40 at one point, that was down more than 1%. It's not just the French elections with the idea you want to take risk off the table heading into the unknown of this weekend, but at the same time, carrying earnings, those really disappointed, so that was a hurt. A little bit better for UK stocks. The DAX, that's also falling more than 1.1%. Again, the more exposed type stocks to higher interest rates and higher yields. Francine, I also want to bring us some breaking lines on Euro area PMI. They reflect a lot of what we've seen also for some of the regions, that the countries we've seen some. It's a beat when it comes to April services PMI. Those rose 47.7. The forecast had been for 55. However, manufacturing, the beat there isn't as strong. It still is a beat, I should say, 55.3. The forecast had been for 54.9. It's this two-speed Eurozone economic recovery. Manufacturing look a little bit more weak. We're at the same time some of the end of COVID restrictions helping to unexpectedly pick up some of that momentum when it comes to services data. So certainly a mixed bag, Francine.
Danny, thanks so much. Now, the chorus of hawkish voices continue. We heard from Jay Powell at the IMF blessing a half-point interest rate hike next month and signaling further support to curb inflation.
It is appropriate, in my view, to be moving a little more quickly. And I also think there's something in the idea of front-end loading whatever accommodation one thinks is appropriate. So that does point, that points in the direction of 50 basis points being on the table. Certainly, we make these decisions at the meeting, and we'll make them meeting by meeting, but I would say that 50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting.
Well, we're now joined by Ed Shing. He's Chief Investment Officer at BNP Paribas Wealth Management. Ed, thank you so much. So fun to see you actually on a terrace, even if we look at market dislocation because of inflation and much more hawkishness across the world. What does that mean for stocks?
Well, it's not great, is it? Because we're at a point where economic growth is clearly slowing. Yeah. More markedly in Europe, but even in the US as well, we can see signs of slowing. We can see that Fed regional surveys of activity are pointing to the national PMI going down, which means manufacturing is going to go down, which means economic growth is clearly going to slow just as the Fed is raising rates.
But so, Ed, are you telling me that, the inflation outlook just got, a lot worse in the last 3 weeks? Or is it that suddenly central banks, faced with the decision of even deal with inflation or, take care of growth, have chosen inflation?
they've chosen inflation for the moment. And I think for political reasons, Jerome Powell doesn't really have a lot of choice, because when you have CPI running 8+%, it's like, that's a huge number,
right.
you know.
But he's behind the curve.
Oh, absolutely he's behind the curve, which is why it's funny he says 50 basis points is on the table. Of course it's on the table. I mean, it's like 8% inflation. What are you thinking?
Okay, Ed, is it a done deal then? It's not.
Yes, I think it's a done deal.
Could we get 75?
Possibly, because I think there is a good argument for saying going harder now makes more sense, and maybe easing off later on when growth really slows down, when inflation also, when it's clear that inflation has topped out and is on the way down, maybe then he can pivot a little bit and calm down the rhetoric, but he can't do it now. He's got to go hard.
I love that, Ed. Of course it's on the table. What are the markets pricing in? Are central banks being led too much by the markets?
No, I don't think so. I think quite clearly, if you look at inflation rates, in many ways, the ECB is in an easier place, because a lot of the pressure in Europe is coming from, of course, what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right? And we're very close to it.
Yeah.
Energy prices, in particular natural gas prices, are a huge problem in Europe. Yeah. They're hurting growth, they're hurting the consumer, and there's nothing the ECB can do. In the US, it's a difficult question because wage growth is an issue. And the Fed can do something about that.
But what I don't understand is inflation being, repriced because then we think the war is going on a long time. Like, for me, nothing that much has changed since the start of the war, but there was a belief in central banks that this was a supply shock for Europe that would end.
I don't think it's just about the war. I think the supply shock also is about what is happening in China.
Yes.
The COVID lockdowns, again, particularly in Shanghai. You have 38 million people locked down. That is spreading across eastern China at the moment. And we know there are huge numbers of ships waiting to dock in Shanghai that cannot dock at the moment because of COVID. Right. So that's going to take some time to unwind. That's something the central banks had not anticipated, and that risks inflation staying high for longer.
In this kind of environment, what do you buy? So what equities? Is it, the expensive stocks that you get rid of and try and find value elsewhere?
Yes, I think commodity producers. It's obvious. I mean, people say commodity prices are already very, very high. Yes, but the commodity producers will continue to benefit from that.
But which ones? The ones that then are used in the transition? So the lithium
Absolutely.
Producers or the dirty stuff?
Lithium's a difficult one. I think yes, but I would say more broadly the industrial metals and the battery metals, whether it be nickel, copper, aluminium, tin, as well as lithium and cobalt, the whole gamut, I think.
Ed, he's just getting fired up, and then we need to talk about the French election a little bit later. Ed Ching, their Chief Investment Officer at BNP Paribas Wealth Management, he stays with us, and we'll talk a lot more about France. When you look at France, when you look at the polls, of course, the market pretty cool about what will happen ahead of that second round on Sunday. The polls have also been widening, which means that when you look at what Emmanuel Macron could do, about 56% if you look at an average of the polls. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First word news, here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. President Vladimir Putin says Russian forces have seized Mariupol, even as his defense minister said more than 2,000 Ukrainian fighters remain holed up in the city. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's deputy chief of staff told Bloomberg the declaration is indeed premature.
The Ukrainian armed forces are still in town. Yes, most of them are blocked in these Azov steel plant, and as well as many civilians which are at that same steel plant, mainly their relatives. My president yesterday suggested to have an exchange of those civilians, of those soldiers who are wounded, to the Russian wounded soldiers which are in Ukraine's possession. Unfortunately, we didn't receive no answer.
Now, Wall Street banks and some international ones too are supporting Elon Musk's run to buy Twitter. In all, $25.5 billion would come in the form of multiple types of debt from a dozen banks across Wall Street and the rest of the world. Now, that's according to a regulatory filing. Morgan Stanley, Musk's advisor, has pledged to provide the biggest chunk of about $5.5 billion. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Now, Smart Conversations continue on Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. This hour we speak to two representatives for each of the French presidential candidates. We're joined by Clément Beaune, he's a French Europe minister, and Herve Juvin, an MEP for the National Rally. Send in your questions on IB Plus TV Go. This is Bloomberg.
Why did you do it? And I say this with great gravity tonight. Because for our country, this is bad news. Because you depend on the Russian power and you depend on Mr. Putin.
I truly want to make purchasing power the priority of my next 5-year term if the French have confidence in me.
Lines there from Wednesday's televised debate ahead of Sunday's election runoff, where French President Emmanuel Macron has attacked his nationalist election challenger Marine Le Pen for her links to Russia. Now, Germany's Chancellor and Spain and Portugal's Prime Minister have all criticized Marine Le Pen in a joint op-ed, asking voters not to back the far-right leader when they go to the polls, but stop short of explicitly endorsing Emmanuel Macron. Now, the gap between the candidates has widened, with Macron on a pace to beat Le Pen. Now, we're joined by Herve Juvin. He's member of European Parliament from the right-wing political group Identity and Democracy. Herve is aligned with Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party. So thank you so much, Mr. Juvin, for joining us. I have a million questions to ask you in terms of exactly, first of all, Europe. If we start with Europe, and you're considered one of the intellectuals, of course, advising us, Marine Le Pen, on a number of issues. So she wants to stay in Europe, but she wants to reform it. Yep. There are talks about border controls, being this. Like, what's your vision of Europe if she becomes president?
My vision is back to the basics. European Union is nothing without the nations. And we have to rebuild a new Europe on the freedom of nations, the sovereignty of nations, and the ability of nations to control their borders. We are at the heart of the European Union, at the birth of the European Union. That's 3 nations, and we have to come back, because at the moment there is a loss of sovereignty for nations, and they are very uncomfortable with that.
But, Mr. Juvin, I mean, if you don't have the free passage of goods, then this is not the Eurozone that we know. So this would change, right? The Schengen Agreement and everything else. They would be a very different...
We don't want to break up with Schengen Agreement. We want the European Union to be in full control of its external borders. It's not the case at the moment. So we have to reform Frontex, the European agency in charge of controlling the border. Frontex is now a travel agency for migrants. We have to put an end to that.
But so if you're an Italian going to France, you could be checked. This is what you're proposing, because this is something that the markets haven't really, don't know what to make of it. It's kind of, you want to control the borders, but you don't want to touch Europe per se.
We want Europe not only as a free market, but also as a political entity. So we have to build on the identities of nations, and we have to build on the freedom of nations.
Do you think France needs to be closer to Russia? I know you've called President Zelensky the puppet of the Americans. What does that mean?
That's quite funny, because at the moment, of course, Mr. Macron attacked hardly Marine Le Pen against her supposed relationship with Russia. But at the end of the day, Mr. Macron met Mr. Putin 5 or 6 times. Marine Le Pen met him only 1 time. At the same moment, Mr. Macron told about brain-dead NATO. Mr. Macron spoke with Mr. Stoltenberg to ally with Russia and China.
But I want to ask you, what would your relationship, if Marine Le Pen is in charge, what would that relationship look like with Russia? If you think the president of Ukraine is an American puppet, what does that mean for support to Ukraine?
First time, Russia has to pay for the invasion of Ukraine. So at the moment, it's not time to speak about a new alliance with Russia. And secondly, Russia is here to stay. We have Russia only 2,000 kilometers from France. So obviously we have to speak with other Eurasian powers like China, like India, and of course like Russia.
Would France under Marine Le Pen give as much support to Ukraine as it is getting now?
We have to support Ukraine because Ukraine is a sovereign country, and we have a deep feeling and very hopefully with the birth of a national feeling in Ukraine against Russia. And we welcome this national feeling in Ukraine. But at the same time and at the moment, we are very concerned about disunity in European Union and maybe the end of European Union as we know it. As you know perfectly well, there is a great divide at the moment.
On oil embargo?
On oil embargo, on financial embargoes, on so many things. Yeah. There is a great divide inside European Union nations, and it's so dangerous.
But what is your position on the oil embargo? Would you go ahead with an oil embargo, given the way things are now?
I'm very lucky because I am a French citizen, and I don't need Russian oil or Russian gas. But I'm not in the same position as Germany, as you know perfectly well. Germany is totally dependent on Russian gas for its industry.
So you think Marine Le Pen, again, as president, would be for an oil embargo?
We have voted for the sanctions in the European Parliament. So I'm very comfortable with that. We are for the sanctions against Russia, and we have to put an end to this invasion before we come to World War III.
Okay, talk to me a little bit about how you fund some of the programs that Marine Le Pen has talked about. So first of all, what does it mean for the deficit? How do you fund some of the tax proposals?
We have a very well-financed program and a very strong public finance trajectory. What is amazing for me is Mr. Macron was talking a lot about entrepreneurship, about innovation, and so on and so on. But who vote actually for Mr. Macron? He scored very well in the 50, 60, 70 years old.
Sir, how do you found your proposals? We're going to talk to the Macron team as well. I want to know your policies. Like, how do you fund some of the proposals that you've put in place?
We want to rebuild strong policies of public finance because it's unbearable at the moment. We want to reduce the deficit, but we want to double the potential growth of France by a sovereign fund. Nowadays, the France Avenir Fund is 30 billion euros. We want to build in the 5 years of the presidency of Marine Le Pen a very strong fonds souverain français of more than 500 billions, because that helps us to go far away 2.5% of growth annually.
Herve Juvin, thank you so much for joining us. He's a member of the European Parliament, and he's from the political group Identity and Democracy. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, from the French elections. Beautiful day in Paris with the Eiffel Tower in the background. Coming up, Vladimir Putin claims that Russia has seized Mariupol, but a top Ukrainian official tells us that's premature. More on that story next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Paris. Now let's get straight to the war in Ukraine. And President Vladimir Putin says Russia has seized Mariupol. However, a top Ukrainian official has told Bloomberg it's too early for Moscow to say it has taken the key port city. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Europe correspondent Maria Tadeu, who also did that important interview. So Maria, conflicting reports, who actually controls Mariupol?
Yes, and Francine, if you ask the Russians, will tell you they control Mariupol now, that this is a victory for the Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin was on TV yesterday saying there is no need to go into the steel plant. That is where 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers are stationed. We're not going to crawl into that. We're just going to seal it. That is the spin that the Russians are putting forward. When it comes to the Ukrainians, they say for as long as that plant holds, that is a Ukrainian city. So you can see, Francine, this is a battle battle on the ground, but it's also a battle and a war information in many ways. But what really matters, and this will really determine who has control of Mariupol, is whether or not the Russians are able to establish a working bridge that connects the east and the south of the country, effectively running through Crimea into the Russian Federation. Like you know, Francine, they've been aiming for this since the annexation in 2014. Whether or not they're able to get it and get it up and running, that will determine really who controls the area.
Maria, very quickly, can Ukraine keep up the fight?
Well, they say they can if they get the weapons. This is why that announcement yesterday by President Biden of another $800 billion into weapons for Ukraine is something that they welcome. But the destruction and the damage already done to this country, Francine, is huge. The IMF now says a 35% GDP construction. So this is, of course, becoming very difficult for the Ukrainian government to handle the situation on the economic front. A lot of damage already done.
Thank you so much, our Bloomberg Europe correspondent Maria Tadeo there in Brussels. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more from the French elections. The French Europe Minister Clément Beaune on Sunday's presidential election. That interview is up next. We'll talk about Europe. We'll talk about Ukraine. We'll also talk about some of the funding for some of the proposals. This is Bloomberg. It's on the table. Jay Powell says a half-point rate increase in the next Fed meeting is possible. Lining up the money, Elon Musk secures billions from Wall Street in his bid for Twitter while pledging $21 billion of his own wealth. And stay with Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition ahead of the final round of the French presidential election. Not only are we live in Paris, the most beautiful background, but we also speak to France's Europe Minister. He's Clément Beaune, and you can send in your questions on IB Plus TV Go. So good morning, everyone, and welcome from sunny Paris to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. We're looking at, of course, the French election special coverage, and I am Francine Lacqua, indeed close to the Eiffel Tower. Now, first, though, let's check in on the markets. Danny Berger has all of the action in London, and Dan, it's all about the Fed and, of course, the hawkishness that we're seeing from several central banks.
Yeah, the Fed, the ECB, there's a little bit of hawkishness coming from the BOE even. Now markets have priced in 3 consecutive basis points worth of hikes for the U.S. over the next 3 meetings. That means it's all about rates this morning. You are seeing your 10-year yields pick up just about 3 basis points. It had been wobbling before, but that's coming back into the market. Not enough to totally throw off U.S. equity futures this morning. They're basically flat, but it was enough to crater markets yesterday. Stock markets finally waking up to the reality of higher yields, and Europe playing some catch up with that. Europe also off the lows of the morning, down 0.7%. A lot of earnings mixed into that as well. Some concerns around Kering, Gucci, sales weren't as strong, French election and all of that. Francine, I'm sure you're well aware of how much risk do you really want to own going into the weekend. And sterling getting hammered this morning, down nearly 8%. We had really bad data out this morning on the consumer as well as retail sales. And Francine, just getting some breaking lines crossing on PMIs. And it is a miss for services PMIs coming in at 58.3. The forecast had been for 60. April manufacturing PMI coming from the UK, that's a little bit stronger, 55.3. The forecast had been for 54. Not moving too much when it comes to the pace and direction of cable. That was already down, still down around 1%, as you can see there, Francine.
Yeah, it's amazing, actually. The cost of living already taking a bite, certainly for the UK economy. That's going to complicate things a lot more for the Bank of England. Danny, thanks so much. Now, on the last working day before France votes on Sunday, some polls have shown that Emmanuel Macron is on pace to beat Marine Le Pen, while domestic French and European leaders rally around the incumbent president. Now, in a televised debate ahead of Sunday's election runoff, he claimed that by taking out a loan from a Russian bank, Marine Le Pen had made herself dependent on Russian power.
Why did you do it? And I say this with great gravity tonight, because for our country, this is bad news. Because you depend on the Russian power and you depend on Mr. Putin.
I truly want to make purchasing power the priority of my next 5-year term if the French have confidence in me.
Okay, those were the two candidates, of course, in the debate, the only debate, and that was on Wednesday. Now, we're joined by the French Europe Minister, Clément Beaune. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. I have a million questions on spending, on taxes, and things like that. But first of all, is there a danger of complacency? We're 2 days away from the election. Polls basically almost say it's a given, by 10 percentage points that Emmanuel Macron becomes president. What's the danger?
It's not a given, so the danger in every election is to think that the vote has taken place before the vote. We will see how it goes on Sunday. Of course, we are trying to fight until the last hour. As you said, it's the last working day and the last campaigning day. So I will be, like a lot of colleagues and supporters of Emmanuel Macron, fighting and trying to convince until late tonight. But we should say that we need high turnouts and we need people to vote for Emmanuel Macron, not only to say they don't want Marine Le Pen, but to vote in a positive manner for Emmanuel Macron.
So who are you trying to reach? Is it the undecided voters? Is it the Jean-Luc Mélenchon voters? Have you identified a type of voter that needs to come on your side to make sure you win on Sunday?
We don't want to kind of divide society in a political market with shares that you had to convince. But of course, it's important for people who would be tempted not to vote because they didn't vote in the first round, for instance, 25% of the voters around this. And also some people who are, we can hear this in the debate, tempted to say Le Pen or Macron, neither the one, neither the other. We don't want this because it's a huge choice to make between, I think, a positive project for economic reforms, for Europe, for public services and so on, and Marine Le Pen on the other side, who has presented herself in a kind of softer manner in a way, but she remains a far-right candidate that we have to identify and to sometimes debunk the myth of a soft version of Le Pen.
But, Minister, what's surprising as an outsider, and I know that the polls have widened, and I know that the markets think that Emmanuel Macron will be president on Sunday, is still over the last 6, 7, 8 years a swing of France to the extreme and to the more nationalistic candidates. How can you explain that?
To be frank, I think it's a bit more complex than this because we saw in the first round also that on the left, with Jean-Luc Mélenchon getting 22% of the votes, very close to Marine Le Pen, actually.
An angry vote, maybe?
Yes, it's an angry vote for both, probably, with different reasons, basically, behind this. For Jean-Luc Mélenchon, probably there were a lot of voters who say the traditional left-wing party, the Socialist Party, is not strong enough, is actually kind of disappearing. So we want to vote for a more radical left-wing guy, but to say in a way we are proud to be left-wingers and we want more social elements in the platform and so on. But there is this element of being radical in our democracies. We can see that, unfortunately, not only in France. We could see that through the Trump vote, the Brexit votes, with the AfD in Germany, in Italy and so on. I think, to be frank, it's a long-term trend in our democracies. I must also say, on a more positive note, that when you look at Le Pen's platform, I think it's basically the same as it was 5 years ago, especially in Europe. She said more clearly 5 years ago.
She says no Frexit, no leaving the EU.
I mean, a signal. She says no Frexit because she knows that Frexit is not popular with French voters and that leaving the Eurozone is not popular with French voters. But at the same time, that's what I try to say to French voters every day, every hour. In practice, she wants to do the same because she wants to leave the energy market. She wants to reduce unilaterally our budget contribution and so on. So de facto, it's the same risk. But the only reason why she does not present Frexit as such is because this element of radicality is not in the French vote anymore.
But I want to focus on your policies because, so let's say that you win on Sunday, Emmanuel Macron gets a second presidency. What happens in the third round, as we call it, which is June? How do you make sure that you have enough control so that actually you can get the job done? What happens if you have a cohabitation? Is there a chance that someone like Jean-Luc Mélenchon would even have the power to become prime minister?
Again, nothing is a given, not even the victory in the what you call third round, the parliamentary elections, which will take place mid-June. I'm confident in the case of a re-election of Emmanuel Macron that we are able to get this majority to get the job done, to get the reforms done. It was, I recall this, always the case in previous presidential elections, that after that you get a majority in Parliament. But we will have to fight for this too, because it's the third time in 20 years that you have the far right in the second round. So it's a reality. A lot of voters vote for the other candidates because they just want to avoid having the far right in office at the Elysee. But Jean-Luc Mélenchon is betting on this. Some voters, we have a strategy to say, okay, I voted for Macron, I didn't want Le Pen, but now I will change the situation for parliamentary elections. But I think it will be very important, but this is the next step, to say we need a majority to get the platform implemented and to get the job done.
What happens if you can't? So what happens to this country?
We will manage, I think, but first we have to win the presidential election, which is my main concern today.
Yeah, which is 2 days from now. Talk to me a little bit about how you're seeing Europe at the moment. So because of the Ukraine war and the invasion of Russia, do you feel like countries have come together a little bit more, or actually behind the surface are they really splintering, for example, on the oil embargo question? It's
always difficult to get unanimity, to get consensus in Europe or in a club like NATO and with allies across the Atlantic Ocean, but we managed so far, and I think it's already a very strong signal of unity, of firmness towards Russia. To be frank, I think Vladimir Putin was betting on this lack of unity and this lack of firmness. We have at the EU level already 5 waves and packages of sanctions, very strong. We are discussing now an increase in the sanctions. Of course, it's related to the energy sanctions that we could take. It's more difficult because the pain we will get for that is higher too, and we will have to protect our consumers, our citizens against the backlash effects in a way on oil prices, for instance, but we will have to do it. I mean, we have been very clear in the presidential debate as well. We will have to take strong decisions on increased sanctions in the weeks to come.
Minister, do you think the cost of living and the high inflation will dominate everything in the next 5 years?
I don't know, to be frank, about the next 5 years. I think it's in all democracies a concern by people who are always checking and asking, sometimes, especially in France, public authorities to act to protect purchasing power. It's clearly a concern that will be very high in the next months. We have to be clear, at least until the end of the year, because even before the war, there were tensions on the energy markets. We could see energy prices rising, and the war, I hope, will be as short as possible, but the effects of the war will last at least a few months. So we have to be very transparent towards our citizens. I've been during the campaign. The prices will go up in a lot of sectors again during the summer and probably a bit later.
Minister, thanks so much for joining us this morning on Bloomberg TV. That was the French Europe Minister. He is Clément Beaune, of course, joining us to talk about that campaign, but beyond, also to talk about inflation, Ukraine and Europe. Now, make sure you tune into our special coverage of the election this Sunday. We'll be live on a Sunday. It's very unusual for Bloomberg, from 7 p.m. London time. That's 8 p.m. Paris time. This is to really see what those election results. That's as soon as we can talk about the exit polls. So don't miss it. We'll look at full market reaction also across the board this Sunday, and this is Bloomberg.
I would say that 50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting. The big issue that we're very focused on is inflation and getting inflation back down to our 2% goal.
Our inflation is fueled by a supply shock, which calls for a particular type of response, which brings together fiscal policies and monetary policy. It is supply driven, number one, and it needs to be addressed in a sequential, flexible, gradual way.
It's too hot. You know, it's unsustainably hot, but notwithstanding it, it's a very, very good labor market for workers.
So that was a stellar panel, actually, over there at the IMF. We're just also getting some breaking news out of Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB. We were just hearing there telling ECB policymakers to hold back criticism. Now, this is according to Reuters. We did hear in the past many other presidents of central banks saying that they don't like leaks. They certainly don't like criticism, because that's then interpreted that the markets, and it can also be market moving. We also had that breaking news a couple of minutes ago. China said to face its biggest oil demand shock since early 2000s. That could lead to a dislocation again in some of the other commodity markets. We're back with Ed Ching, Chief Investment Officer at BNP Paribas Wealth Management. So this is something, actually, China is said to face the biggest oil demand shock since the early 2020s, so in the last 2 years, which is a good headline, but not market moving or certainly not earth shattering. Ed, save me. When it comes to I mean, if you look at China and this headline coming out, China said to face the biggest oil demand shock since 2020. I mean, sure, we knew that, right? It's kind of like...
It's not the issue. It's not the issue. Look,
what is the issue? It's lockdowns.
Yeah, the issue is lockdowns, and the issue is the property market. The biggest issue is actually the property market because they still haven't dealt with that, the Evergrande and the fallout from Evergrande, in a controlled fashion, in a comprehensive fashion. They should be creating a bad bank to hold property bad debts, putting that aside and allowing banks to get on with the activity of lending, and they're not doing it at the moment.
So we're so distracted by inflation. We're so distracted, by some of the atrocities that are happening, or of course in Ukraine by, this election. Are we underestimating that the biggest risk to the world economy is China right now, and also slow down in growth?
Yeah, because the problem is you have the US already slowing down. You have Europe slowing down. What's the third engine? It's China. If we have all three engines slowing down at the same time, it's not good news, is it? So that's the problem. And I think we focus so much on the first two engines, we've forgotten about that third engine.
But could it lead to a worldwide recession? Like, what are we looking at? What's worst case scenario here?
Yes, a worldwide recession is clearly the worst case scenario, particularly if Fed monetary policy gets tightened too far and provokes a recession in the US. Because already, if there's a recession in the US, that is one of the biggest export markets in the world for China. That makes life difficult for China. Europe's the second export market. It's already slowing down. So how do we escape if the Fed goes too far?
Right. Is there a risk that the Fed goes too far? And actually, what does it mean for French stocks that are already, they're ignoring this election, right? For the moment, there's a bit of a discount, but I don't know whether that's because of ECB
There's a tiny bit of volatility. Yeah, but, it's not a big deal because ultimately, if you look at the opinion polls, President Macron has a 10 to 13-point lead across the opinion polls at the moment. The TV debate changed nothing, so the markets are not really pricing in heavy volatility.
If Macron becomes president again on Sunday, do we see a bit of a lift in the euro dollar? Does it change anything for spending?
Not really.
Give me something, Ed. What will it change?
Well, the biggest driver will be monetary policy on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah. I find it very difficult to understand why the ECB has a negative deposit rate today. It still has a negative. We have negative interest rates in Europe still today. Why?
Why?
I don't know why.
Wait, did you see that headline?
Yes.
Christine Lagarde asks for no criticism.
Yeah, I get it, because I think what she's trying to do is quell a little bit of dissent within the ECB governing council. Because there are some people obviously pushing to go faster, and she's saying, well, we've got to take a moderate stance. We don't need to follow the Fed. We don't have the same issues. And it's true. They don't have the same issues as the Fed in terms of wage growth. That's for sure. However, a negative deposit rate. What's going on? We can go to zero. It will be zero impact on growth. Zero. So why not do it?
But it helps the banks.
But it would help the banks. Exactly. So why not just go ahead and do at least that?
Okay, Ed, thank you so much. Ed Ching, their Chief Investment Officer at BNP Paribas Wealth Management. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, from Paris throughout the day. We'll be back here on Sunday and Monday. But now, let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. CNN's new paid streaming service, CNN Plus, is shutting down just a few weeks after it launched. The abrupt end comes at the hands of a new corporate leadership team. And despite a major investment by the network with big-name anchor recruits and costs into the tens of millions of dollars, the collapse is a potential warning sign for media companies joining the increasingly crowded streaming space. Now, Gucci sales growth missed estimates in the first quarter as lockdown in China weighed on the performance of the biggest Kering brand. Sales at Gucci, which generated over half of Kering's revenue for the period, rose about 13%. Analysts had predicted a gain of almost 19%. The figures follow strong results from LVMH and Hermes last week. And Disney is set to lose perks as Florida's Republican-controlled legislature cleared a measure to strip the theme park's special tax status. This is escalating a feud between Governor Ron DeSantis and the entertainment giant over the criticism of the state's so-called Don't Say Gay law. The move raises questions about who will be on the hook for paying back about $1 billion in municipal bonds. The White House says DeSantis should not have taken action against Disney. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Coming up, driving off with the prize after weeks of speculation, the Tesla boss lines up $46.5 billion in funding, the latest on Elon Musk and his Twitter takeover offer. That's next. This is Bloomberg. So after more than 2 weeks of questions over whether Elon Musk is truly serious about his Twitter takeover, his bid just got a lot more real. The Tesla boss has lined up more than $46.5 billion in funding, and he's going to throw in a big chunk of his own cash also through equity financing. Well, Bloomberg's Laura Wright has been following the developments. Laura, you and I obsessed about this story. So how feasible is Musk's latest offer?
Well, $21 billion equity commitment from Elon Musk. That's far more liquid cash than he has in the bank at the moment, Francine. So he's likely to have to bring in an equity partner. Debt financing will be provided by investment banks such as Morgan Stanley. They will provide the largest chunk, and Barclays. Now, if Elon is to go ahead with a tender offer, in addition to that original unsolicited bid for the board, it will need to be at a premium in order to persuade at least 50% of shareholders. It's been a tumultuous period already. Initially, it seemed as though there was a bromance between Elon Musk and Twitter's CEO Parag Agrawal. That passive stake became active. It's now turned into a hostile takeover attempt, Francine. But we'll see. It's all to play for.
Yeah, it's just such a good story, Laura. Thanks so much, Laura Wright. So we're back with Ed Ching. Ed, I feel like it's a love story between Wall Street right now and Elon Musk because they're looking to fund Twitter. Like, what happens with Twitter? Does it go to the valuation, or is this just a vanity project?
I think it's a tough question because the thing is, Francine, the bid isn't actually that generous. So he's been very smart about this. And it's true that I find Twitter an amazing platform. And, of course, he is a master user of Twitter. He knows best of all the value in Twitter. I mean, the amount of free advertising Tesla has got via Elon Musk's Twitter account, it's just incredible. So he understands that is worth a lot more than it is today.
Is this a vanity project? You know, another billionaire looking at something that he wants to buy because it's a jewel in the crown? Or does this make financial sense?
I think this does make financial sense. I think he's absolutely right. There is a lot of lower-hanging fruit, and I do think the Twitter management has underutilized, underexploited the very valuable real estate they have on their hands. And I think absolutely, if he doesn't take it private, someone else will, at perhaps a higher valuation. And this may be a good way to flush that out.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are excited about the fact that he wants to get rid of the bots that are on Twitter. Talk to me a little bit about it. What do you do with tech valuation in general? So Netflix got slammed. I mean, wow, that was ugly.
Well, you cannot afford to disappoint on earnings. And that's the bottom line. And Netflix disappointed not only on earnings, but even worse, on subscriber growth. And this has been a worry of Wall Street for a while, and it just became very, very real. And we've realized that yet another lockdown winner is becoming a post-lockdown loser, like Zoom.
Right. But this is also because you have inflation up, and if I need to cut down, then I cut my Netflix account instead of not buying toothpaste.
And the competition, I mean, you've got Amazon, you've got Disney, you've got HBO Plus, you've got a lot.
Bloomberg.
You've got a plethora of alternatives which perhaps you didn't have a few years ago.
There you go. You can watch Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition instead of Bridgerton. This is what Ed Ching recommends. Thank you so much, as always, Ed, Chief Investment Officer at BNP Paribas Wealth Management. We'll have plenty more, of course, throughout the day right here in Paris. Up next, the Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour with Matt Miller, Kailey Leinz in New York. Our Tom McKenzie is in London. We'll talk about markets. We'll talk also about the Paris elections and Twitter. This is Bloomberg.
High prices, high inflation, they're disruptive. Like, they make life challenging.
The Fed has actually, put us in a pretty difficult position.
In the near term, the Fed is going to do what they can to get their credibility back.
I would say that 50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It is 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in Hong Kong on this Friday, April the 22nd. Our top stories today. It's Fed Chair Jerome Powell's most aggressive approach to inflation yet. He's looking at 2 or more half percentage point rate hikes. In France, Emmanuel Macron is closer to winning another term as president. Nationalist leader Marine Le Pen is running out of time to narrow the gap between them before the runoff election on Sunday. And Elon Musk's attempt to buy Twitter has gotten a lot more real. The world's richest person has lined up more than $25 billion in debt financing and is pledging $21 billion of his own money. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom McKenzie, stepping in for Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. What a day, Kailey.
What a day indeed. Happy Friday to you, Tom. It's been a long week again. Now, it definitely was a painful end to the week for most parts of Asia. You had the MSCI Asia Pacific Index as a whole falling to its lowest level in more than a month, with Japan and Hong Kong creating a drag. One bucker of that trend, though, was actually Chinese equities. The CSI 300 rose about 0.4%. You have authorities within China encouraging funds to come in and buy equities, try to stop the bleeding to an extent in the Chinese equity market. That working at least for today. Speaking of things that have been bleeding, that would be really the global bond market. The selling pressure has been intense all across the world, and that is true too in Australia as the market bets on more aggressive policy from central banks, including the RBA. As a result, you saw that two-year yield in Australia moving up 13 basis points. A lot of movement at the short end. 238 is where we sit at the moment. That is the highest going back to December of 2014. And of course, while a lot of central banks are getting more hawkish, the BOJ certainly is not. They are sticking with easier policy. That has kept the Japanese yen around a two-decade low against the U.S. dollar. We're still trading right around that 128 level, Matt.
All right, well, U.S. Treasuries can't keep up with the Aussie two-year level, but we are at the highest since December of 2018 on the 10-year yield, 294.72. You can see the yield rise here as investors let go of that debt. S&P futures coming down as Jerome Powell hardens his hawkish position, and as we hear from banks like Nomura, who are forecasting a 50 basis point hike followed by 275 basis point hikes. It seems like everybody on the street's trying to one-up each other. NYMEX crude down 2% right now, but that's not helping the market. 101.75. Maybe it'll give us a little bit of a lift later or reduce the losses that we see at the open. And Bitcoin not moving much and still hovering around that 40,000 level that it's fallen to this week, 40,389. Tom, what do you see going on in Europe?
Yeah, Matt, some divergence in the European markets. The FTSE 100 is lower by about 0.6% here in the UK, digesting some retail sales data. That weighed on sterling, just pointing to the squeeze on the consumer here, the cost of living crisis, something I know that you're reflecting on stateside as well. We're, of course, looking at what's happening in France with the elections. That final vote on Sunday, the CAC 40 is lower by a little over 1%. We continue to watch that, with Bloomberg Intelligence suggesting you could see a re-rating of French equities to the upside if Macron proves victorious come Sunday evening European time. Across the benchmark then, losses of 1%. Of course, so still adjusting to the earnings picture, yes, but it seems the focus, as you've been discussing, more squarely now on what's happening in the central banks and those hawkish comments, not just from the Fed and Jay Powell, but also ECB officials as well this week. The CAC 40 currently down 1.4%. Again, we continue to watch that. Arguably undervalued versus the rest of the European space. Some of that risk around Marine Le Pen is priced in. We'll see if there's a re-rating, again, depending on how those results pan out. Euro-dollar 107. Pressure on the single currency, down 0.3%, largely as a result of dollar strength. And when it comes to the yield space here, the two-year German up by 6 basis points in terms of the yields, again factoring in the more hawkish Jay Powell, but also that sentiment from the ECB as well, arguably playing catch-up, of course, from Madame Lagarde. Let's switch on and see how things are playing out when it comes to all things Russia. We continue, of course, to watch the events and that battle in the Donbass region. We had Olaf Scholz of Germany, the Chancellor, speaking to Spiegel, saying that, look, even if we cut off gas from Russia into the German market, that's not necessarily going to end the war. So again, seeming to push back on additional sanctions when it comes to energy. Well, certainly gas. You're seeing losses of 0.5% across the Russian benchmark. A bit of strength there, though, for the ruble, up 3%. And in terms of the bonds, of course, we continue to watch whether or not they will slip in to default on some measures. That is already starting to happen at the sovereign level. That is the run of play across the Russian markets. Matt, Kailey?
All right, Tom, well, let's talk about what else is going to be ahead on this Friday. It is Earth Day, of course. Nearly every industry and many nonprofit organizations are spending the week and month promoting promoting climate change. We'll also get U.S. PMI data at 9:45 a.m. New York time today, and we will have an interview with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen coming up at 11:45 a.m. New York time. Really looking forward to that one, Matt.
And we have, tonight is the Fish Show at Madison Square Garden. It's
Of
the New
course.
Year's Eve show, rescheduled. I'm very much looking forward to that, but also focused on the Fed. Jerome Powell is helping to harden the Fed's hawkish pivot. He spoke at an IMF panel yesterday.
There's something in the idea of front-end loading whatever accommodation one thinks is appropriate. So I would say that 50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting.
All right, so Jerome Powell says 50 basis points is on the table for May. That is Nomura's call, but now they're changing it. They expect 75 basis point hikes in both the June and July meetings after a 50 basis point hike in May. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta is joining us now with more. So Nomura really going for it. The market pricing not quite there yet, though.
Not quite there yet, but not far off either, which is really interesting because the 75 basis point is something that we've heard from James Bullard a lot, right? That it's on the table, but it's not necessarily something that he's making his base case. What he is making his base case is 50 basis points in May, and that's really where you're seeing the market as well. The market now pricing in about 52 basis points for the May meeting coming up on May 4th, but also the June meeting and even the July meeting. So it really tells you here that the hawkish kind of move that you're seeing in the markets could eventually accelerate to 75 basis points. Let me give you the possibilities here that if you start to see a market getting ahead of itself, does that actually perhaps create a little bit of a cushion? If the Fed under-delivers on that hawkishness, does it actually boost the markets? That's going to be a lot of questioning about how do you actually position for this at a time that's coming right off the heels of the worst bond sell-off in history on a quarterly basis when you look at the first quarter sell-off.
Okay, Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta, thank you. Just checking in on a redhead that's crossing the screen right now. Traders pricing in a 50 basis point hike by the ECB by September. So markets continue to readjust to the more hawkish commentary that we've had out of the European Central Bank, of course, adjusting to the inflationary picture here. It's not just the traditional hawks, but it's also the Spaniards coming out suggesting that you've got to be raising rates within this environment. Just checking in on the German 2-year yield. Again, yields up 6 basis points. And, of course, sovereigns here adjusting to that more hawkish stance from the ECB. Money markets pricing it in. Let's get over to Ukraine now, what the situation is doing and how things are unfolding. President Vladimir Putin says Russia has seized Mariupol, but a top Ukrainian official has told Bloomberg it is too early for Moscow to say it has taken the key port city.
The Ukrainian armed forces are still in town. Yes, most of them are blocked in these Azov steel plant, and as well as many civilians which are at that same steel plant, mainly their relatives. My president yesterday suggested to have an exchange of those civilians, of those soldiers who are wounded, to the Russian wounded soldiers which are in Ukraine's possession. Unfortunately, we didn't receive no answer.
Okay, let's get more with Maria today, our European correspondent who joins us from Brussels. Maria, what do we know about the situation in Mariupol and the broader conflict that's now unfolding in the Donbass?
Yes, and Tom, there's a battle that is clearly happening on the ground, but there's also an information war and a propaganda war on both sides. When you listen to the Russians, what they say is that they now control Mariupol. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin said this was a victory. Congratulations, everyone. That was his comment on TV, and also said he was not interested in that steel plant where there's still 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers stationed there. He said, all we need to do at this point is just seal it. We're not going to crawl into it. With the Ukrainians, and you heard it in that clip yesterday, my interview with Herve Juvin, he is the diplomatic advisor to President Zelensky. He says for as long as that plant holds, this will be a Ukrainian city. But I guess the point now, and this is really what matters, and this is really the reason why Mariupol is so strategically important for both, is that this is the bridge that Russia has wanted to create for 10 years now. It's a bridge that connects Crimea to Mariupol and then all the way to Donbass. And today we have comments already from a Russian general saying that in this new stage of the war, Russia will focus on securing that connection between the south of Ukraine, the east of Ukraine, and then into the Russian Federation. So you can see here that this battle is not just going to get ugly on the ground, but in size is also expanding.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. Maria Tadeo there, our European correspondent in Brussels, bringing us up to the latest. Now, let's get to Washington, D.C. Yesterday, President Biden temporarily caused confusion with his response to key issues facing the administration on immigration. He thought we were talking about mask policy with him. Let's get to Emily Wilkins, Bloomberg government reporter, for details on the mix-up. Emily, do we know what was happening?
So, Matt, we know that these were two obviously pandemic-related issues. One, Title 42, dealing with the ability for migrants to come into the U.S. That's been very restricted during COVID. And, of course, the other one, as you mentioned, that federal mask mandate. Biden was asked about the immigration provision. He gave an answer, meaning the mandate. The White House did clarify later in the day. It comes at a point, though, where a lot of individuals within Biden's party, the Democrats, are initially questioning his decision to roll back this immigration provision by May 23rd. They're saying that they need more time. They need to come up with a plan for immigrants who are coming to the southern border. And they're worried there's going to be a giant surge. And again, these are lawmakers within his own party. It also comes as a time where Republicans have really been targeting the president, questioning his mental health, questioning his ability to do his job. He's currently 79 years old. He's one of the oldest American presidents. And this isn't the only gaffe that we've seen from Biden in recent weeks. And every time this happens, you do see the Republicans really push back against Biden, question whether he's going to be able to serve a second term.
Indeed, a time when, of course, his polling has plummeted. Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government in Washington. Emmanuel Macron now closer to winning another term as French president. That's as nationalist leader Marine Le Pen runs out of time to narrow the gap between them before the presidential runoff ballot on Sunday. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua, who's leading our coverage of the election in Paris. Is it all clear for Macron at this point, Francine?
Bonjour, Tom. Now, we just spoke to one of his closest advisors, and he says, look, it's never a done deal. But if you look at the polls, they've certainly been widening. He has around a 50%, 56% actually chance of becoming president. And that gives it, well, 56% in terms of people that vote for him. And that's about an 85% chance of becoming president. But then, of course, you need to ask yourselves what kind of majority, if any, he would get in June. So the question is, Tom, does he change his policies to try and appease some of the people that didn't vote for him? Does it mean that we're going to see a more fiscal spending, fiscal loose France? And what does it mean for the policies going forward? But certainly for the moment, the markets are pretty much placid. I mean, they think that he'll be president, and they're not really concerned about anything else France induced.
There is another issue related to France right now. We see they've issued an arrest warrant for Carlos Ghosn, who's currently remaining a fugitive in Lebanon, right?
Yes, I mean, this is the ex-car supremo. I mean, this is surprising, Matt, because the lawyers on the Ghosn side also seem to be making out this could be linked to the election. They, I think, mentioned something about the timing, the fact that France now have issued this international arrest warrant to coincide with the election. Basically, they're implying that it would look good for maybe the people in power if he were to crack down on the rich. Now, there was very clearly a lot of anger in France about how much Mr. Ghosn was paid. Very interesting. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the legal situation too much, but he initially wanted to be charged in France because then he had access to documents. So it's something that we need to follow very closely, and I think also we'll be speaking to him a little bit later on, so it'll be interesting to see how he positions, and I think for the moment he's really surprised that it's happened.
All right, Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua in a beautiful Paris. Thank you so much. And Francine, as she mentioned, we'll be speaking with Carlos Ghosn later today at 11:15 a.m. New York time. And of course, don't miss Francine also in our coverage of the final round of the French presidential elections this Sunday, 2 p.m. in New York, 7 p.m. in London. Now let's get back to the markets and take a look at some stocks moving in pre-market trading here in the U.S. One of the big underperformers, Gap. This stock dropping like a stone. It's down about 12% in early hours after cutting its sales forecast. It also said that its CEO and president of Old Navy will be leaving the company this week. So that is weighing on the shares this morning. We also got a report out after the bell yesterday from Snap. Of course, this operates the Snapchat app. A lot of kids use that one. It actually did report better users than expected. Those were up about 18% year on year, but the forecast wasn't as great. So that is weighing on the stock a little bit this morning, down nearly 2%. And elsewhere in social media, we of course have to check on Twitter. The news came that Elon Musk maybe indeed has secured funding for his bid. $25 billion in debt commitments from banks, including Morgan Stanley, another $21 billion coming from him. How will this develop over the weekend? This is a really interesting one. Right now, Twitter is up about 0.8% before the bell, Tom.
Yeah, laser focused on that story, of course, for lots of obvious reasons. More on Musk's bid on Twitter coming up. Could the billionaire go higher than his best and final offer? And on the markets, Dan Boardman-Weston, Chief Executive and CIO at BRI Wealth Management, get his views on these markets. Plus, on the French election, of course, Alexandre de Hoop-Scheffer, German Marshall Fund's director of the Paris office. If Marine Le Pen pulls this off, what would it mean for the economy of France and the geopolitics of the Eurozone? Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom McKenzie in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. So, after more than 2 weeks of questions over whether Elon Musk is really serious about his Twitter takeover, his bid just got a lot more real. The Tesla boss has lined up more than $46.5 billion in funding, and he's got skin in the game. He's going to throw in a big chunk of his own cash through equity financing. Laura, where does he stand in terms of this bid? He's managing to get the cash together. He's been reaching out to some of the investment banks. It seems like they're lining it up.
Yeah, $21 billion equity commitment from Elon Musk, although it's much more than he has in the bank at the moment. So he's likely to bring in an equity partner. As you mentioned, investment banks will bring in around $25.5 billion. Morgan Stanley is going to be the largest player. Now, this financing, Tom, implies an 18% share price premium to that original unsolicited offer. Twitter's board, they've still not responded to that, albeit they've started implementing some defensive measures. A higher share price premium is advantageous for a tender offer because you have to persuade at least 50% of the shareholders. What a roller coaster ride it's been, though, since April the 4th, when we first learned that Elon had become the platform's largest shareholder.
Laura, I want to ask, I don't know if it's hitting as hard in London as it is here, but a lot of New Yorkers in media left various companies to go join CNN Plus, and they just rolled out to great fanfare last week. They have, I think, 100,000 subscribers, and now they're closing shop already. What is happening at CNN?
The cost of content is expensive, Matt Miller. Netflix, for example, they're coughing up $18 billion this year. And that recent merger between Warner Bros. And Discovery, they're undergoing a cost-cutting scheme. And it seems that the already $500 million that they've spent on launching out CNN Plus was simply too much to take. It's a competitive space.
They just spent $500 million this year.
They did, but, you know, they're cutting their losses, Matt Miller. Get out while you can seems to be the approach, while the streaming industry is highly competitive and, you know, retaining subscribers. As we learned from the first mover advantage holder this week, Netflix, it's not easy.
The streaming struggle, 400 jobs, I think, tied to that as well, CNN Plus. Thank you, Laura, for bringing us up to speed on that development, as well as all things Tesla, Twitter, I should say, and Elon Musk. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz with Matt Miller in New York and Tom McKenzie in London. Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. Shanghai has vowed to step up enforcement of lockdown measures to prevent community spread of the coronavirus. China is in the midst of its worst outbreak since the pandemic began. Shanghai's 25 million residents have been in one form or another locked down for weeks now. The city reported a record 11 deaths yesterday. The U.S. again is threatening China, meanwhile, of sanctions if it offers material support for Russia in its war in Ukraine. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said China wasn't helping the situation in Ukraine by doing things like amplifying Russian disinformation campaigns. She also promised to help India end its dependence on Russian weapons. President Biden will sign an Earth Day executive order today aimed at safeguarding old-growth forests. Those forests have come under threat from wildfires and drought. Scientists have identified old-growth trees as critical to fighting climate change as they function as reservoirs for carbon dioxide, a key greenhouse gas. And the feud between Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis and Disney has gotten worse. The Republican-controlled legislature has passed a measure to strip Disney of its self-governance privileges in the state, where it employs 70,000 people at its theme parks and hotels. The fight started when Disney criticized a law DeSantis backed that limits school instruction about gender identity and sexual orientation. And Tom, for our global audience, this is essentially a culture wars story surrounding Florida's quote-unquote don't say gay bill, as it now has been dubbed, which Disney initially was reluctant to do. They didn't want to wade into those waters, but pressure, walkouts from Disney employees forced Bob Chapek to eventually come out against the bill, and now there are political consequences.
Yeah, I've been trying to understand this story. Of course, Florida's at the top of the list in terms of holiday destinations for Brits. And one of the first things you do, of course, is go to Disney. So the politics, as you say, impacting the corporate sector. And that there are these privileges they had, but they may now go, right?
Exactly. So it's definitely a saga that continues to unfold.
OK, plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition, and here is what you need to know. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has outlined his most aggressive approach to taming inflation to date. He has potentially endorsed 2 or more half percentage point interest rate increases. At the same time, Powell described the labour market as overheated. In France, Emmanuel Macron is closer to winning another term as president. Nationalist leader Marine Le Pen is running out of time to narrow the gap between them before the runoff election on Sunday. Polls indicate Macron has about a 12 percentage point lead. And Elon Musk's attempt to buy Twitter has gotten a lot more real. The world's richest person has lined up more than $25 billion in debt financing from Morgan Stanley and other financial institutions. Musk is also pledging to contribute another $21 billion of his own money through equity financing. I'm Tom McKenzie, stepping in for Anna Edwards in London, Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. Matt.
Yeah, what we're seeing, I think, is really interesting here in markets, Tom, because this is the second time this week that we've had a cemented hawkish position from a Fed speaker, this time from Jerome Powell himself. And we don't really see a lot of negative reaction in equity markets. This, to me, says a lot of it is already priced in, right? He said 50 basis point rate hike is on the table. Nomura came out and said you could see 2 75 basis point hikes following that. Remember when Bullard brought up a 75 basis point hike? I thought that was going to spook the market as well, and we actually traded positive by the end of the session. So the S&P futures are down, but only by 0.1%. We see the 10-year yield up, but only to the highest level since December of 2018, and that's a level that we've seen pretty consistently over the past week. So not a heck of a lot of movement spurred by the comments that you would think drive markets mad normally. NYMEX crude is coming off 102.02. That could be a little bit of the support when you see that come out. It relieves some pressure on the market, on the equity indexes. And then Bitcoin is down, but not really moving much, hovering around the level we've seen all week, 40,457. Kailey, what do you see in terms of the pre-market movers?
Well, I am taking a look at social media stocks in the pre-market in particular, because of course you had one of them, Snap, reporting after the bell. It operates the Snapchat app. It had really stronger user growth than was expected in the first quarter. Users up about 18% year on year, but the sales forecast going forward wasn't so rosy, and that is weighing on the stock this morning. It's down about 1.4%. A mixed read-through for some of its other social media peers. Pinterest is lower today. It's down about 1.6%, but Meta Platforms, which of course operates Facebook, is higher by about 0.6%. And outside of the earnings story, the user growth story, one story that we continue to follow is Twitter and Elon Musk's bid. Maybe financing is indeed secured after he said he had $46.5 billion in financing commitments lined up. More than $20 billion, $25 billion of that in debt financing from banks like Morgan Stanley. Another $21 billion is supposed to come from equity financing from Musk himself. The question is, where is he going to pull that from? We still don't know that answer. We still don't know how Twitter is going to respond. They said they've received the updated proposal. They're going to take a close look at it. Right now, Twitter's up about 0.9% before the bell.
The really awesome part, Kailey, is that, he said this is all about free speech and democracy. He doesn't even care about the economics. The financials mean nothing to him. And yet, banks are willing to lend him $25 billion to do the deal. So altruistic of them. I'm really, my faith is restored. I want to break some news here that the timing is incredible on this, Tom. Renault said to explore pairing its Nissan stake to support the EV shift. Now, this is, to me, almost ironic because one of Carlos Ghosn's charges is that he has been ousted. It was a smear campaign in order to reduce the strength of the partnership that he built between Renault and Nissan. And indeed, on the day that we see France issuing a warrant for his arrest, Renault says they're going indeed to reduce that strength by pairing their stake in partner Nissan. So I think really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and clearly investors are rewarding that decision, at least the details of that as it continues to come through. And there's an argument that maybe it reduces that political tension that we know did come between the French and the Japanese partners, of course, if they reduce that stake and the funding that's needed to power EVs. Let's check in on the markets then across Europe. You're down 1%. There's a readjustment, of course, factoring in the earnings, but also readjusting to the more hawkish Fed, yes, but also ECB officials who over this week have come out with a more aggressive stance, at least rhetorically, and you're now getting the markets pricing in a 50 basis point move by September. So you continue to watch that as well, of course, as what's unfolding in Ukraine. We keep a firm eye on France. The CAC 40 is lower by more than 1%, 1.2%. Bloomberg Intelligence saying you could see a re-rating of French equities if Emmanuel Macron, the incumbent, of course, proves victorious in that Sunday runoff election versus Marine Le Pen. So we're watching that. Worth noting, by the way, manufacturing services data for Europe came in stronger than the forecasts at a time, of course, when many economists are downgrading their outlook for the Eurozone economy. Euro-dollar is under pressure, 0.3%, largely, you would imagine, as a result of dollar strength. And the German two-year yield up 5 basis points, coming off a little bit. It was up 6 basis points, but again, readjusting, repricing around the sovereign bond space here in Europe. The sovereigns, the peripherals, certainly an area potentially of concern if you get a more aggressive ECB, what it means for BTPs and Spanish yields, for example. Over in the Russian markets, you're seeing losses of more than 1% on the benchmark MOEX. You've got strength, though, in the ruble, up 3%. You had some comments from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to Spiegel, suggesting that he's not keen still on pursuing an embargo of Russian gas. He says that wouldn't bring an end to the war. Again, ruble up 3% in the session today, and that's the 10-year on the Russian bond space. Not much movement, 3 basis point move, but of course the question marks about whether or not Russia defaults remain in focus for us. Matt?
All right, I'm looking at a chart that goes way back. Indeed, as I look here at the legend, all the way back to the first time I ever saw fish. We're talking like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, 9 Inch Nails to the early 90s. This shows the hawkishness of the Fed, and you can see the big mountain in the middle there is an Alan Greenspan monument. But we've seen a huge jump. In fact, the most aggressive Fed hawkish shift that we've seen I guess in 20 years, basically. Joining us now is Dan Boardman-Weston, Chief Executive and Chief Investment Officer at BRI Wealth Management. Dan, the striking thing to me is that from Bullard to Powell to Nomura now, it doesn't seem to rock these markets very much. Is all this priced in?
I think a lot of it is priced in. I mean, it's been quite a dramatic shift for markets throughout the first 4 months of this year. And a lot of it is baked in, and thus you're not seeing markets move a huge amount, or equity markets. I think the interesting thing will be, in the past, an aggressive Fed tightening has always caused the economy to fall over. And whether this leads to recession at some point during 2023, I think is the question investors are trying to grapple with.
What do you think the answer to that question is, Dan?
I think the economy is going to slow materially, I think across the world, not just because of tightening central bank policy, but a host of other geopolitical factors. I think it's a moot point whether we flirt with recession or not, but I think growth is going to slow a lot, and it wouldn't surprise me if we enter a recession next year.
Okay, well, when we talk about the bond market reaction to all of this, to the implications for growth, but also to a more hawkish Federal Reserve, we're left with a 2-year yield at 2.75, a 10-year yield at 2.94. Are we reaching the point now where bonds actually are an attractive buying opportunity?
I think you are. You've seen a lot of big bond investors come out over the last few weeks saying at these sort of levels, bonds start to look attractive. And if your market hypothesis is that actually the Fed is going to go too far, it's going to tip the American economy or the world economy into recession, then 10-year bonds at 3% starts to look attractive. And so whether this is the top of yields, I don't know. But I think at these sort of levels, bonds are getting increasingly attractive.
Dan, if you're looking for shelter within this environment with all the geopolitical risks and, of course, the macro around the central banks, where are you looking? You're looking at equities or other assets at this point?
So we're looking at removing some of the cyclicality out of our portfolios, so economically sensitive stocks, and moving more into defensive equities. We've also got quite a large exposure to infrastructure assets, certain parts of the commercial property market, notably sort of industrial. And also we've got a large amount of cash as well for clients, which ideally we will look to reinvest into bonds. And I suspect we will get the buying opportunity within the coming couple of weeks or months to deploy that capital.
Dan, are markets underestimating the potential drag from China?
I think so. I think with what's going on in the world, with all eyes are on Ukraine, and quite rightly so, I think markets aren't really paying much attention to China's zero COVID policy and what impact that's going to have on the world economy and also on supply chains. I mean, if we go back to early 2020 and when we saw the initial supply chain issues with China locking down, I think markets are underestimating that. And I think what that does is it probably extends the runway somewhat for this inflationary period that we're going through, as China does seem set on a zero COVID policy, which is going to lead to economic disruption in China and across the world.
Can I just ask you, as we prep for this, I guess, final round of voting in France, how much does it matter? I mean, are you actually concerned that Marine Le Pen, that the far right, could take over Europe's second largest economy?
I think if we've learned anything over the last 5 years, it is take the polls with a pinch of salt. No one predicted Brexit. No one really predicted Trump coming to power. And I think with Macron at 55% and Le Pen at 45%, which is the latest polls, I think she could easily do this. Do I think this is a good or a bad thing for France? I think it's probably a bad thing for France and a bad thing for Europe. But again, I think all eyes are focused on the Ukraine crisis at the moment. And so the market fallout from a Le Pen victory, I think, will be relatively muted. I think Ukraine and inflation are the primary drivers at the moment. And a Le Pen victory, I think, won't drive markets to a huge extent.
Interesting, Dan. A Marine Le Pen victory would not have a major effect on the markets. That seems to be against the consensus. Great insights. Thank you for your thoughts. Dan Boardman-Weston, Chief Executive and CIO at BRI Wealth Management. Just to recap, one of the breaking stories, a redhead across the terminal, Renault shares rising, currently 5.2% on the news that the company is considering selling part of its Nissan stake. That is partly to fund its shift into EVs. We're going to hear from former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn at 11:15 a.m. New York time. That's 4:15 p.m. in London. Don't miss that. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later today, Spanish Economy Minister Nadia Calvino. That's at 12:30 a.m., 10:30 a.m. in New York, 3:30 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kailey Leinz with Matt Miller in New York and Tom McKenzie in London. Well, let's get back to the French election, where Emmanuel Macron is closer to winning another term. Francine Lacqua is joining us now from Paris with Alexandra Deup-Scheffer, director of the Paris office for the German Marshall Fund. Francine?
Yeah, thank you so much. I was looking actually at the latest polls, Kailey, just to make sure that we're not missing anything. The trend seems to be there. The spread, if you call it, between Macron and Le Pen is actually widening. We look at a 56% vote for the moment for Emmanuel Macron on Sunday. So we are delighted to be joined by Alexandra. Thank you so much. This is, of course, a conversation on politics, international, and what this means if Emmanuel Macron, like the polls seem to suggest, we could see an upset, but at the moment they give him president. What does his policy, how does his policy change domestically and internationally in the second term?
Well, I think the first thing he will obviously have to do is change his, what I would call his leadership style. he will have to change his leader style domestically and internationally and on the European level. What's really interesting, we have several offices across Europe, is that our European partners are not looking at Macron the same way they did back in 2017. In 2017, he was perceived as Europe's savior, right, against, again, Marine Le Pen. This time, 5 years later, there's much more skepticism, there's much less enthusiasm, because he has also been quite disruptive and shown a certain amount also of unilateralism across the EU in his way, of portraying French policy.
So, Alexandra, so what is the problem actually with the way he portrays himself? The French, and this is the voters, basically see him as elitist, out of touch, not really, concerned with the cost of living and things like that. If you look at the policy, he did try and help and temper inflation. What's the perception for abroad? That he fights too much for France? That he goes at it alone?
It's that when he speaks in the name of Europe or of the EU, people see him as speaking for French interests, right? And so this has sometimes brought a lot of frustration. I'm talking, for example, of European strategic autonomy, which is very much impulse from Paris. And this concept and the way Macron portrayed it was not often understood, sometimes seen as autonomous from the US, from NATO. And he has done, I must say, this last year, a lot of effort explaining it in a much more constructive way.
Talk to me a little bit about if Marine Le Pen becomes president. Again, we cannot discount this at the moment, even if the probability is quite low. What does she do with NATO? What does she do with Russia? What will be the place of France within Europe?
Well, the first thing I think that she can easily do is actually implement one of her decisions, which is to withdraw France from NATO's military integrated command. Just by sending a letter to the other allies of the Atlantic Alliance, but that would have a direct impact on France's credibility within the alliance. Within the EU, what I see her doing, she has really been moderating, nuancing her position of the EU. She's not talking of a Frexit. She's not talking of France getting out of the Eurozone. So what I see her doing is pretty much not a lot, is taking a step back, but trying to impulse a reform from the inside, right? And that, to a certain extent, resembles very much what Macron has tried to do these last 5 years on many levels.
Well, and let's talk about Macron a little bit more, because you mentioned, Alexandra, earlier that there's a perception that he's speaking for French interests, not European ones. And he has said previously that the French don't need Russian gas, but Europe as a whole is reliant on it. He has said he would continue to support sanctions on Russian gas. If he is re-elected, do you think he will have success pushing for that on the European level, or that other political pressures will force Europe to finally make that move?
No, absolutely. That's really Macron's goal. And it's true that in the context of the war in Ukraine, Macron has really been leading the European effort, right? The European response. Also, I would say by default of a strong German leadership, right? So he has really put himself into that leading role. And obviously, he is also pushing for this oil embargo. So definitely, if Macron gets reelected, that's going to be one of his European priorities, to convince his European partners that we need to move forward in that path.
What will his relationship be, Emmanuel Macron, or actually Marine Le Pen, with the U.S. for the next 5 years? I remember this, pretty ugly spat with submarines, and that was like 6 months ago.
Yeah, well, what was interesting is that this AUKUS alliance really triggered once more a national debate about France's role relationship with the U.S., with NATO. Macron, despite his brain-dead, debate and everything he triggered, is probably the most Atlanticist French president. Marine Le Pen is very much more skeptical about that. She has a very NATO skepticism, EU skepticism, and much less, I would say, eager to show a certain amount of alignment with American policies.
Thank you so much for joining us, Alexandra. Alexandra de Upscheffer of the German Marshall Fund, as well as Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua in Paris. And of course, be sure to stay, Tom, with Bloomberg this weekend.
Yeah, indeed. We're going to have special coverage, of course, of the French election. That's Sunday at 2 p.m. in New York, 7 p.m. here in London. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kailey Leinz in New York. Tom McKenzie is with us out of London. Now, Tom Keene is a co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance. He joins us to talk about what's ahead on the program, and I believe you have a chart of wheat. Tom, what's your single best chart?
Well, it's a chart of wheat because this is what matters in France. First of all, Sudhir Hazare-Singh, who I interviewed in 2017 out of Oxford, is definitive on the French people, and his essay this morning in the FT is absolutely extraordinary, from the Fourth Republic to the Fifth Republic to the Sixth Republic of Mr. Macron and Madame Le Pen. Matt, it's real simple. It's wheat, and it's the moonshot from the tenure of Mr. Macron in 2017 with the beginning of the pandemic, and up we go, higher and higher we go. The baguette reality. Matt, I'm going to cut out here. My audio just collapsed.
Okay, Tom, I was going to ask about BlackRock's Jean Boivin. I know he's turning up on the show as well, whether or not you're going to be asking him, of course, about what happens with the French politics. I know Bloomberg Intelligence, interestingly, Kailey, saying that you could get a re-rating of French equities if Macron succeeds in holding on to the presidency. Kailey?
Yeah, of course, we all wait for Sunday for those results. Meantime, what are we watching today on this Friday? Happy Friday to everyone. I will be watching later on around 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will be joining Bloomberg Television. She's going to be speaking with David Weston. I'm really looking forward to getting her thoughts on so many different issues. Of course, you have sanctions on Russia and the latest U.S. thinking from the Treasury on that front, but then also just the broader economic environment, as there is growing talk about potentially recession risk in 2023 here in the U.S. What are her thoughts on that and on Federal Reserve policy, Matt, as she's not just the Treasury Secretary now, she was chair of the Federal Reserve.
Absolutely. It will be fascinating to get her take, and I can't wait for that David Weston interview. I'll be watching Balance of Power as well. But I'm preparing for fish. Now, a few important dates that you should know. New Year's Eve, typically Fish plays traditionally a Madison Square Garden run over New Year's Eve. They had to cancel that this year, but they wanted to reschedule this month, and they couldn't do that unless the Knicks got thrown out of the playoffs, because otherwise the Knicks would need to use the Garden. So fortunately, on March 31st, the Knicks lost their final game in the playoffs and opened up the way for Fish to kick off their run, which they started on 4/20. But today, 4/22, is the day that they will reprise the actual New Year's Eve show, on which they typically play a bunch of covers and do some fun gags. And then, of course, they're going to play tomorrow. I have tickets for tomorrow night, but I'm still kind of looking for a miracle for tonight in a number of different ways.
It's hard to follow that, Matt Miller. Number 10, Farmhouse. That's Rolling Stones' decision in terms of where the song comes. I know it's your favourite. Lushington, they've got at number 1. Anyway, that's what Matt Miller is watching. Matt, come in.
Well, I mean, Farmhouse, I think, is the most popular album. I like songs from Tweezer to Gotta Jaboo to You Enjoy Myself, but you should check them out.
OK, you've also got to watch the French election, of course, consequential not just for that country, but the Eurozone and global geopolitics as well, arguably. Stay with us, Early Edition Surveillance with Tom, Jonathan and Lisa up next. So this is Bloomberg.